Big welcome to everybody to our Evidence Matters series. I'm Carrie Chihawk, and I've spent my career in public service, both at the federal and the local government levels, using data and evidence to advance equitable community outcomes. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. It would be great if those of you in the audience could give us a little sense of who you are. Pop into the chat, your name, organization, and what's bringing you to the conversation today. We'd love to know a little bit more about what's on your mind. And I'm here with my co-host, Vincent Kwan. Vincent, do you want to pop on and say hello?
Sure thing. Very excited for today's conversation. I'm Vincent Kwan, and I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Innovation at JPAL North America. And for background, JPAL North America is a research and policy center based at MIT that focuses on evidence-based policymaking and using rigorous research to identify and ultimately lift up proven solutions for economic opportunity. So very excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, great to be here with you, Vincent. And, Evidence Matters is our collaborative learning series that's bringing together researchers, governments, and community perspectives on what it really takes to promote rigorous learning to advance equitable outcomes. And I was just thinking, as I was getting ready for this, Vincent, it's our fifth year in Evidence Matters. Can you believe it?
It's hard to believe. Time really flies. I still remember when you and the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, Leo, launched this webinar series back during the pandemic many years ago. And JPAL North America has always been such a champion of the series. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why we had announced you as our inaugural government evidence champion back in 2023. And it's really exciting to see how far Evidence Matters has come in the past 5 years.
Yeah, it's amazing. I can't believe how much time has flown. And both Leo at Notre Dame and I were so excited to bring JPEL on as a formal partner in this series. We all bring complementary perspectives to this and a common mission of really speeding up learning across places. So sharing what's actually working to improve economic mobility in our communities.
And I think it's those complementary perspectives that really define what Evidence Matters is all about. We're not focused on the headline results of individual research studies, but rather digging into those in-between spaces, what we often call the messy, real-world work of building and sustaining government research partnerships to build high quality evidence that decision makers ultimately can use to change practice and improve outcomes for the residents that they are hoping to serve.
Yeah, and it can actually really be messy sometimes. And I think that, our topic today is a great illustration of that. There are a few things messier than government budget processes, and there are also a few things that have a greater possibility of actually producing results. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
And that's why I'm so excited for today's conversation about evidence and budgeting. It's more than just bringing evidence forward into budget decisions, but rather, I think the budget process can be a mechanism to build an evidence mindset, a culture of learning within local government.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Vincent. And today we have an amazing panel of people who are going to share their experience and reflections on how they go about doing just that, building that culture of learning through using evidence in the budget process. So let's go ahead and introduce them, shall we?
All right, let's start off with Sam. Sam Quinney, welcome to the conversation. Can you say hello and introduce yourself?
Sure. Great to be here. My name is Sam Quinney. I am the director of the Yale for Connecticut initiative at the Tobin Center for Economic Policy. And prior to this, I spent about a decade working on evidence and evidence-based budgeting, among other things, in the lab at DC, in the Washington, DC government.
It's so great to have you here, Sam. Sam is one of the founding members of the lab at DC, and the lab is an applied research and design team that's actually part of DC government, and that goes back to 2016. And those of us who are interested in evidence-informed policymaking really look to the lab as a leading best-in-class example. And they've produced not only a bunch of rigorous studies that have helped to improve the lives of people in DC, they've also made government processes like forms, budgeting more accessible and using evidence in all of that. And since I'm singing the lab's praises, I also want to introduce Ryan, who's worked all around the world actually, bringing a community perspective into civic processes. So Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Flynn. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. I am a civic design researcher with the lab at DC, which is an evaluation and design shop within the government of the District of Columbia. And for the past 3 years, I've co-led our effort to bring evidence to bear on city budget decision-making processes.
Right. I'm very excited to hear, Ryan, about your experience and perspective as a civic designer. So definitely looking forward to digging in there more during today's conversation. Let's travel to the other side of the country now. On the other coast of the United States, we have Ricardo. Ricardo, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you. Hi, I'm Ricardo Basurto-Davila. I'm the Chief Evaluation Officer for the County of San Diego, where I lead the Office of Evaluation Performance and Analytics. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we just call it OEPA. And if you hear me throughout the answering questions, refer to OEPA. That's what it is. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, great to have you, Ricardo. And OEPA was formed just a few years ago in 2021, I think. And under Ricardo's leadership, San Diego County has really become a place that we're all looking to as doing some of the most exciting work in evidence-informed policymaking. So I think those of you in the audience are really going to appreciate hearing Ricardo's experience, which is more recent, about putting evidence into the budgeting process alongside the lab at DC, which has several years more history doing this. So now let's turn to our esteemed moderator for today's conversation. Jen, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Tolentino. I'm based out of Los Angeles. I'm the director of local practice at Results for America. And prior to this, I've been with Results for America for about 5 years. Before that, I was the director of innovation for the LA Mayor's office.
So Jen brings not only experience working within local government in LA, but most recently has been leading cohorts of local government at RFA's evidence and budgeting sprint. So we're really excited, Jen, for you to lead today's conversation.
Yeah, you're the perfect person to help walk us through this, Jen. And um, I'm sure some of you have been engaged in some of the work that Results for America has been doing. Uh, we'd like everybody to participate by putting your questions into the chat, share your reflections and your question. Jen's going to moderate a conversation for us over the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A. At the end, we'll collect your questions through the chat, try to answer some of them in the chat, and then hopefully get to some of your questions live towards the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen to kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm excited to dig into this with all of you. So we have three really interesting and useful perspectives represented here. Sam, who helped launch this work in DC, Ryan, who is carrying it forward and making it work for departments now, and Ricardo, who is still in the early stages of building this into San Diego County's budget process. So what I'm hoping we can explore together is not just why evidence matters, but what it actually takes to make it part of the way government works. How do you get started without making this too big or too burdensome? How do you build trust and buy-in across departments? How do you use evidence to support better budget decisions while still leaving room for innovation, learning, and equity? So I'll start with just one quick grounding question for each of the panelists. And as Carrie mentioned, we will have time at the end for audience questions. Please feel free to add those questions into the chat as well, so we can kind of have a queue going, and we'll get started. So the very first kind of quick question for everybody. You are all coming at this from different stages of the work. From your perspective, what is the budget challenge this work is helping to address? So maybe I will first pass it over to looking at who looks most ready. Ryan, you smiled. Let's go with you, Ryan.
You caught me before my mute button was ready. Um, sure. Well, as you said, we've been working on this for several years. We've done a lot to standardize how agencies submit evidence for consideration in budget making decisions, and then how that's processed. And that solves a couple related problems, if you'll give me the liberty. The first is practically and immediately, it lets us process evidence at scale to make decisions across historically, hundreds of proposals in the course of a budget cycle. But just as importantly, we've been increasingly focused on designing processes that help build the muscle for evidence-based decision making in the budget and beyond, through creating expectation that evidence be brought to the table, and supporting agencies, regardless of where they are in terms of their own practice, to try to find and propose the evidence that decision makers need to make evidence-informed decisions, whether it's the budget or other program decisions.
Great, thank you. Ricardo, what budget challenge is this work helping address?
Is that sort of the typical economic problem, right? The limited resources. We have a number of needs, important. San Diego, like many other places in the country, we have challenges with homelessness. Justice system is also a very important part of our budget, etc. And everybody would agree all of these are important issues to address and to solve. But we need to figure out not only how we prioritize, but also how do we make sure that we are spending our money on things that actually yield the results that we want. And it's very difficult without a explicit approach, an explicit framework to try to tease out, what actually has intended impacts from what doesn't, to do that prioritization. Everybody's invested in the things that they do, and sometimes it's difficult to be objective and in making those decisions if you don't have a structured approach to make the decisions. So anyway, that's the challenge of trying to address to this.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense that this brings order and data and evidence into that decision-making process and enables you to really center resident outcomes. It's great. Sam, what do you think?
I think I'd build on what Ricardo and Ryan said. It is the key challenge is folks that are making budget decisions at every level of government. You don't have a crystal ball. You don't know what's going to happen in the next year. You don't know how well something's necessarily going to play out, what other challenges are going to come up. But when you incorporate more evidence into budgeting, it gives you a better chance to kind of narrow in on the scope of what may happen, be more prepared for things that come along, but also by being really certain that of the things that you can do, you're going to have the best path to impact, as Ricardo was saying.
Amazing. Okay. All right. So it makes sense. There is a very clear challenge, and there is some aspect of a solution that I think we're all circling around. And so, Sam, I'm going to pass it to you first to kind of maybe get started. When you were first getting this work off the ground in DC, how did you think about building buy-in across agencies and budget leaders? And how did you avoid using evidence, not just another compliance exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. For a little bit of context, and Carrie shared this a bit in her intro, but the lab at DC started in DC government in 2016, 2017, depending on when you count. So about 10 years ago, at an important time in the evidence-based policy movement, and a time where there was a lot of different things being tried. And I would say where the Washington, D.C. government started, and in the administration of Mayor Bowser, was really kind of a curiosity about how evidence could be used, and an idea of, okay, we have this new team, let's see how this could play out, and how could you make our budget decisions a little bit better or a lot better. And so there's some things that I would share from the beginning of it in terms of building buy-in and making things authentic is going to be a combination of things that we did at the time and also that we learned over the years, because a lot of it has to be a learning process and you're not going to get it perfectly from the start. But what it boils down to is when you're thinking about evidence and asking agencies to justify with evidence what they're asking for in the budget process, is to show that it's going to be used, show that the evidence that they provide is going to be used. And so I think I have one slide that I'll briefly flash up here. This is a budget cycle, roughly for Washington, D.C. There's a lot of places on here where evidence could be used. But a key part of making it authentically useful to agencies and to the government is picking an area to start and somewhere where you and your role actually can make something happen and something different. And so these are all of the parts of the budget process in Washington, D.C., preparation from agencies, formulation in the executive branch, a legislative process, the execution of it, the assessment of it. You could put evidence in all of these areas, but pick somewhere to start. And we knew that because we were based in the mayor's office and reporting to the budget director, it was in this area where you see the little graph next to it, that we had a role where we could authentically do something with evidence and show that it could be useful. And so you can take that slide down for that part of it. And so that's a big part of it, is showing that it's going to be used and making sure that it's being used fairly. I think anybody who's been in government, who's been in an agency, who's been in different parts of it, is very familiar with compliance activities and also gotcha activities. Nobody wants to be hearing from the auditor. I didn't see any auditors in the chat so far, but maybe a very important role to play. And so it's really important to make sure that if you're asking for evidence, you're trying to have people bring it into the process that's going to be used, but it's going to be used fairly. Anybody who's worked in social science research or program evaluation will know that if you look at the things that we could be confident are going to work, it's about this big, and I don't have enough room on my screen to show the breadth of things that state and local governments do, but it's beyond this much. And so to be really thinking about how we can treat evidence as one part of that full budget process, a process that includes laws, it includes politics, it includes feasibility, it includes state capacity, and finding a role for it and making sure that it's one part of it. And one of the ways that we did that in Washington, D.C. from the start is to really allow it to be less about accountability and less about kind of gotcha moments and more about how can evidence make an agency's case stronger. So you want to invest in this program, you're making the case for why we need to, for example, invest in a different model to address homelessness. Well, if there's evidence supporting that model, that's a bonus. That's an extra point in your favor on top of all of the other things. And Ryan may talk a little bit more about how that plays out. And then the final thing that I would say is that it's important to make it conversational. The thing that people hates about compliance activities or kind of government black boxes is you put your information in and then either you hear nothing or you just hear an unjustified decision afterwards. And so what we tried to do, especially over the years, is make evidence a conversation between agencies and us and other parts of the budget team and the mayor's office about, okay, what are you trying to do? What evidence is there? What evidence might you use in the process? And that makes it build that authentic relationship between what we are trying to do, which, as we started talking about in this session, is we're trying to get to the best outcomes possible.
Fantastic. That's so helpful to kind of really orient how you framed it, the ongoing relationship building aspect of like, how do you get the buy-in? What does it look like? How do you show that it's actually meaningful? I think that like feedback loop of continuous improvement too is really important. So now I'm curious, Ricardo, as we've discussed, you all are just starting this work. And so I'd be interested to learn kind of how are you thinking about building those relationships, trusts, and sort of what are those first manageable steps that you're thinking about? Like, where is your decision point that you're maybe kind of approaching this work from?
Yeah, that relationship building is a crucial step, and especially for us, and I'll explain in a minute why. Um, I think if you ask anyone who's in the audience right now, and pretty much anyone in the world, I mean, they would agree, yeah, of course, government should spend the money on things that work. So it sounds like it should be easy for this to happen, right? I mean, it's like, well, everybody should be doing it, but it's not that simple. And part of the reason is that finance folks and the evidence folks or evaluation, whatever you call us, we operate in different worlds. We speak different languages. Right? You talk to the finance people and they talk about general purpose revenue and encumbrances. And uh, for example, I hadn't heard about encumbrances until I had this job, and I had probably been a director of my department for a whole year before I even heard the word encumbrances. I had no idea what they were talking about. I don't know how many of us in the audience actually know what that means. And on the other hand, we speak about randomized controlled trials, statistical significance, theory of change. And so it's not that easy to communicate and come to actually just even agree that we want the same. Now, in some places, and I believe that's the case in DC, evaluators work side by side, with finance, with budget management. So that makes it a little easier to sort of start heading in that direction, right? To interact, realize, hey, we should be working together. It's not the case in San Diego, right? Our chief financial office is separate from OEPA, and so building that relationship was really a critical first step for us. Just a random random thing that happened yesterday. We actually had a budget hearing yesterday, a public hearing yesterday, led by our board of supervisors. And in the public comment, somebody mentioned no romance without finance, and I had no idea what he was talking about, but it clicked with me, and I thought I need to mention that tomorrow at the presentation because I think at the end of the day, we realized there's no way that OEPA can take this on our own. I mean, and suddenly make the county invest in things that work if we don't involve the budget folks. And so now, how do we do that? And last year, Results for America actually gave us the perfect opportunity to do that. They organized a 5-week sprint called County Budgeting for What Works, if I remember correctly. And that gave us the excuse to approach finance and tell them, like, look, we want to invest on things that actually work, but it's tough to get started. Why don't we apply to this sprint and participate, and it'll give us a way to start thinking about this together. They were interested. They joined us. We applied. We got in. And it gave us, obviously, it was the perfect excuse to approach them, right, for the initial approach. But it also gave us sort of a structured environment where we could craft our goals together, agree on, well, this makes sense, this makes sense, this makes sense, help everybody come to terms with this is what we mean by evidence and budgeting, right? This is what it means, this is what it doesn't mean. It helped us engage with other county governments who were also having the same questions, same ideas, same interests, and so we heard what everybody had wanted to do. And most importantly, it gave us the momentum to start working on it and continue working it, right? For 5 weeks, we were talking about this. And then to continue working, which, to date, we're still building. Like I said, we're getting started, but we're actively building towards how we're going to figure this out. I should say, just to close the question, is that building a relationship with finance was only the first step of this, right? I mean, in terms of involvement, the budget cycle, all departments in the county are part of it. You have department directors, you have the program managers, people who figure out this is what we want to do, this is the new program that we want to create, this is how we want to address this problem. And so eventually all of them need to understand what we're trying to do and need to embrace it, right? And Sam mentioned earlier, first step is for them to actually believe that the evidence, if we're asking them to provide the evidence, that evidence is going to be used. If they don't believe that it's going to be used and they just say it as a checkbox, that is just part of their of what they have to do, then it is less likely they're going to embrace it. So that's our next step in terms of building those relationships, and the buy-in is to make sure the folks understand what we're trying to do and that they believe that we're onto something that can be good for the county.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's so interesting to see sort of Sam, where you kicked it off and where it is now, which I'm excited to bring Ryan into the conversation, and Ricardo, sort of like you using that sprint as an organizing moment to sort of build that bridge with the budget office. And full disclosure, did not plant that RFA plug, but very grateful for it. Thank you. So Ryan, turning to you. You've continued the momentum that was built, now going on 10 years. And I mean, how are you able to sustain this work, right? There's the initial momentum of like, okay, we're going to do this, we're doing it well, but what does it mean to kind of continuously have this refined? You have a human-centered design background, so very curious about how you're, focused on improving this ongoingly with departments, and what have you learned about the process being more workable? And are there any like tools or templates or rubrics that, any of the other government folks on this call might be able to steal or replicate?
Sure. I mean, first of all, a big part of it is that delivering on what Sam and Ricardo were talking about, being good, honest brokers and partners, being useful to decision makers, being good conversation partners with agencies, as they seek to develop an evidence-based proposal for, what they're experts in, and what they want to do to shape the services to citizens. And then another big piece of it is standardization and process. It allows our team to continue to do all of those things. I know we're blessed with a larger team than many governments have that's focused solely on evidence generation, but nonetheless, there's more that we would love to do, and so we need to focus on being efficient. And so just a little bit of background on like how we function. We sit centrally. As Sam said, we come in relatively early in the budget cycle, when the budget that the mayor will propose is still pretty fluid. And we serve as a hub of sorts, a conversation partner, if you will. And so agencies will propose what they want to do with the marginal dollar. Every agency starts with a budget, or a budget envelope, they budget to that. And then they're asked, what would you do if you had a little bit more revenue? A little bit more money to play with. And most years, this year, our economy and our revenue are tight enough that this didn't play out government-wide the way that it usually does, and the way that I'll explain. But agencies are asked to propose, okay, what would you do with the marginal dollar? And that's where we focus on those proposals, because that's where, to Ricardo's point, the sort of thinking at the margin, or that we could do this or that, and we want to bend it towards the best possible impact for resident, is most stark. And where evidence, in our view, can really play an important role in helping guiding decision makers. And so standardization through a couple of tools, which you see on the bottom, helps us make it as easy as possible for agencies to make an evidence-based case, and help budget writers process that at scale. In a normal year, outside of last year, there'd be over 200 proposals that need to be considered. And so I can show just a little bit about how we've approached this. I know that there are many other folks with lots of experience doing similar things from around the country, friends and colleagues, and I'd love to see what they think on the chat. But I can talk a little bit through our process. And it hinges around two forms. The first one is the budget proposal form, what we call, in glorious government speak, Form 2. Which is filled out by every agency when they want to make a proposal for something to do with the marginal dollar. And some of that are things that they want to do something new, or they want to expand on a program they think is promising, and evidence is required to make that type of proposal. Now, there are other types too, restoring one-time funding that fell away, or something like, procuring a piece of software, there's a business case. Evidence is optional. We read all of them and consider all of them. We give each proposal an evidence star rating, which I'll show in a minute. But if you stay here for just a second, we put a lot of thought into trying to make it as easy as possible for agencies to submit the same information, and to submit the type of evidence that really moves the needle. And so we ask 4 questions, which you may not be able to read, but are on the second page here. So first of all, what's the outcome? What are you trying to move? The second is, what evidence supports your conviction that, within your ability, this is the best way to approach moving that outcome. The third is, how is your proposal similar to what the evidence says works? And the third is, how is it different? Recognizing that, you can't just drop something from one place and put it into another without consideration of context. And so on the basis of that, we give every proposal a star rating. And if you go to the next slide, I can just talk through a little bit about what that looks like. And so this may look familiar to some folks. It's not our invention. It comes from the federal government, IES, and the Treasury adopted that for the state and local recovery funds that were part of the COVID recovery package. And so these star ratings are largely process-based, largely based on how the evidence was generated. Give budget writers a sense of like what type of causal claims you can make. If you're getting 4 or 3 stars with a reasonable set of assumptions, you can say, okay, intervention X had a part in causing outcome Y. But we don't stop there. To Sam's point, that there's a lot. There's a lot that happens outside the gold standard for evidence that's important to decision makers as they balance a variety of considerations. We also want to encourage agencies to bring the best possible information because something is better than nothing from the decision making perspective, and also from building the muscle for evidence informed policy making. And for us, it's also an invitation to a conversation. If there isn't strong evidence, and for many good ideas, there is not yet, maybe it's an opportunity for us to work together to build that evidence base. When we're not doing the work on budget, the lab at DC, runs evaluations and works with agencies to build evidence. And so this is an entry point for those types of conversations as well. I'll say just I've been talking a lot about like format and process, and that's all important, but conversations are also important, and we also recognize that the form 2 that we that we put forward is in many ways our best opportunity to communicate to agencies about the importance of evidence. And so, I bring a design lens to this. I think about the experience of forms and processes. And one of the things we've been working on as a team over the past couple of years is to try to reach back even before we formally consider things, into the point where agencies are figuring out what they want to propose, to bring evidence to support their use of evidence there by really clear instructions, really getting feedback on not just what the rating is, but why, and offering help to people at the formulation process to have us help them write it so that people don't feel like they need to go it alone or figure it out themselves. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that if the conversation allows, but let me pause there.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing that. And it's very helpful to sort of see both like the form request of how you're asking for this information, but then also paired with the like how are you using it to guide decision making. So I think like seeing the usefulness of the information that departments are providing is really like that valuable like conversation piece. So thank you for sharing that. So one thing that came up when you were presenting, Ryan, that I heard was, this process goes for that sort of marginal extra dollar. Like if you're asking for new funds, like what are you doing and how are you using evidence to make those decisions? Sam, you've often talked about budgeting as a question of trade-offs, like how every dollar spent in one place is a dollar that's not spent somewhere else. And so I'm just curious sort of how evidence can help leaders in this fiscal moment where most governments are not having very many conversations about like additional dollars and where they might put it, but how might that be used to make these choices more cleanly?
Absolutely. It's kind of strange to be in at least the last budget cycle I was in, and the Washington, D.C. government was probably the hardest that we had been through. But there was never a budget cycle in any part of even the quote unquote like good years where everyone's like, oh yeah, this is an easy one. Don't worry about this. We got money coming out of the walls. And so it's kind of funny how it becomes all relative of what a hard budget year is. And this is but it's certainly not funny the kind of economic constraints that the DC government is put under. And so that really draws into focus the current times and all of the costs facing both individual people and their governments, the importance of, as Ryan mentioned, using that marginal dollar better. And I think people who haven't been part of a government budgeting process really think of the top line, and they're often given the top line of, $400 million for education, $700 million for police, or whatever that balance is. And what is often lost, and I thought Ryan did a good job of reinforcing this, is that most of these things, unless you're going to undertake some of the things that have happened, for example, in the federal government, a lot of these budgets are really durable. There's things that have to be done by law. There's things that are politically untouchable. There are things that are obligated over time. Governments have to pay their own debt for anything they did even decades ago. They sometimes need to pay settlements for things that they did many decades ago. And so really, as Ryan put it, we're really talking about like somewhere in this like 3 to maybe 10% range within a budget. And it's thinking about that extra money goes fast. How can you do the most with that dollar? And I think it's really important that people think of that as the key place for evidence to play a role. And so I think that when you're thinking about, okay, how should we spend this $1? That's where we get into these decisions of trade-offs. And somebody put in the chat a question about how do you think about things across different contexts and research areas or populations. And here's how I tend to think of it, and how I think the lab's budget process has played out, and really more philosophically our role in it. First, it's to not generally think of things like, okay, well, we should spend more money on education and less money on health. Those are the types of things that I think there's probably not a huge role for evidence to play. And those are mostly political decisions or values decisions. Not really sure what the evidence would say comparatively. Like that's not necessarily the best use of it. But thinking about within the outcomes that a government wants to achieve, how can you do the best thing with that dollar? And that's where I think evidence has a really important role to play. And this is my, I hope this works for people. This is my like, this is the graph I have in my head. Don't make me put numbers to it because it starts to fall apart really quickly. But when we're thinking about budget investments, I picture this graph that's on it will be, I guess, the left side of the screen, where we have the true impact of what we're going to spend money on. A homelessness program, an education program, something new for the police force. And that top line is what is actually going to be generated by that spending. It's the true impact of the program. What is it going to do for people? But traditionally, and at the status quo, we operate with this gap, which is that lower line. It's what we know. We have this gap between what we know about what is going to happen with investments and that true impact. And what we're trying to do with evidence and budgeting is to really just kind of drag that lower line up. Bring these things closer together by using more evidence so that marginal dollar is going to be spent better to achieve the outcome that we were thinking of. And to get to the question that someone had asked is I think it's really important to think of the opportunity cost largely within outcomes or within agencies. So thinking about, okay, we can agree that we want to improve, say, homelessness prevention for people. How can we best use our homelessness prevention dollars? How can we best use our education dollars? And evidence and bringing evidence in the process gets us closer to knowing, okay, if we do this, we're going to get that. We will never know that perfectly, but the idea here is to get closer to it.
Great. Thank you for sharing what is in your brain. And we will not apply numbers to it, but it's a helpful visualization of like, where are we going and how might we get to that better decision making through evidence. So thank you. So back to Ricardo, who again, you're getting started. It'd be curious, like part of this conversation has been like getting everybody to agree that evidence matters, right? I think that narrative building, how we're going to use it. Part of that too is like sort of defining evidence in a way that's useful for budget decisions, especially when programs may not have formal evaluations or perfect data. I think Somebody also put in the chat a question around like, how are we talking about a logic model supported by data? I think that question is probably more for the DC looking at the evidence ratings that they use. But Ricardo, I'd be curious, how is San Diego County starting to think about defining evidence? And if you have a response to whether or not a logic model shows up in that, I'd be welcome it, but we can also hold that for later.
Sure. Um, having a clear definition of evidence is a critical part of the process of doing this. Because it gives everybody in the organization, and in this case, organization, I mean the County of San Diego, or 40-something departments, it gives us a standard language that we can always refer back to. If we don't do this, then suddenly we're dealing with everything is evidence-based. And that's a problem that I see, time and time again, that evidence-based became a buzzword, and there's always somebody who finds a way to say this is evidence-based because we have metrics, right? Or because we did a pre-post analysis, or we did a customer satisfaction survey. And so, and the other part of this, and it's related to that everybody will say my program is evidence-based, is there's an emotional investment in departments, staff that have been implementing a program that truly believe in their program, that when we started talking to our finance folks about it, they explicitly mentioned that, is there a way that we can sort of remove that emotional component to think more objectively about, is this working, yes or no, right? It's you want it to work, but how do we know that it works? So building that definition of evidence that we're going to use throughout the organization, it makes it easier for everybody to be talking about the same thing. Another plug for Results for America. During the sprint last year, then you guys share with us resources that you put together that made it much easier to start thinking about this, right? I mean, you have this document with, I think, maybe 20 different definitions of evidence from federal, state, and local government agencies. And you had this cool one-pager, like a step-by-step guide on how do you start crafting your own definition of evidence, right, for where you are. And that was cool for us because it helped us realize we don't have to use anybody else's. It's not like there's the best definition, right? We don't need to use the one from this federal agency or from the state of Minnesota or North Carolina. It's just there's no best. We can try to craft the one that makes sense for us. And I have a couple of slides that are useful to insert here, because as we started talking about this, I don't want to take credit for this. I mean, it's really the team that participated in the sprint. They figure, why don't we craft a definition of evidence that matches the way we, OEPA, want to work with county departments? And you mentioned a logic model. Somebody else in the chat asked if evidence is only really about evaluative. I guess I think they meant the impact evaluation methods. And for us, actually, that's what we wanted to move away from, because the way OEPA tries to work with our departments is all the way through the life cycle of a program, right? We don't necessarily want to come in at the end and tell them, haha, your program doesn't work, right? It's if we can actually work from them from the start when they're thinking about designing a program, and we can help them like, look, these are best practices for program design. Let's build a theory of change for a program. And then let's think about, how to make sure that implementation is going well and it makes sense for the context of the County of San Diego. And then, of course, at the end, we do want to make sure that we have reasonable for evidence that the program actually works. But so we think of evidence like a tree, right? It all starts, the strong roots, the foundation of evidence is having a good rationale. Why do we believe that this program is likely to work, right? Not just that it makes sense in our head and in one sentence, but actually how do we map those mechanisms through which a program is going to achieve its intended results. And then once you have that rationale, then let's look at the implementation, right? We are in San Diego, this is California, there's a policy context, there's a social economic context that we gotta make sure that the implementation of the program makes sense for us. And then of course we have the impact evidence, right? I mean, this is actually, we see that it works. Well, using the appropriate evaluation approaches, we can get evidence that it works. So that's how WIPA likes to work with the departments. That's how our team came up with the idea of the evidence tree that reflects how we work with them. But in addition to this, and if we can go to the next slide, we also think that thinking of evidence this way, it also makes it a little easier for us to come up with recommendations for budgeting purposes. The obvious example is a program that has, a strong rationale implementation evidence and impact evidence, then of course, then it makes it easy to make a recommendation like, yeah, if they want more money, they probably should get it. But then there are other combinations, and maybe I'll just go to the bottom where we have a program where we have strong implementation evidence, we have strong impact evidence, but now they're asking for money to maybe scale up the program to a new community, for a new population, additional services. Then that's when we would say, well, hold on, why don't we develop a strong rationale for that scaling up, good theory of change, just to make sure that it actually makes sense, that what you intend to happen with that expansion actually is going to make sense before we go all in, even though we already have some impact evidence. So again, different combinations of these different types of evidence can help us figure out a little better what recommendations to make on the budgeting side. And again, I'm really excited that we're thinking about it this way. This is still early in our process. We're not even yet, to where this is. How do we insert this in a form? How do we get the evidence? How do we get departments? But I think we're off to a good start. That makes a lot of sense for us. And I think the key message for everybody else who's attending and is interested in how can we do this is, again, one size doesn't fit all. I'm not saying everybody should do what we're doing and everybody should have their own tree, but it's more about what makes sense in your context, right? And especially to generate the buy-in among everybody else who has to agree. And I know, Results for America was great in providing us with resources to get to this point, so I'm sure they can also be for others.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate the localization, both of within your local context, how do you apply this evidence-based model? Also, how do you define evidence for what is going to be most useful for your particular government? So I have one final question before we're kind of go into some of the audience questions. I apologize, we're a bit tight on time, but I really want to go back to Ryan quickly. One really powerful part of DC's approach is that evidence and equity are both visible in your process. And so can you just quickly tell us how that has helped decision makers see that fuller picture of all of those program trade-offs?
Yes, absolutely. And so budgets or policy documents, there are historic and systemic inequities in the provision of government services and in budgets. And DC is committed to trying to identify and work against those. We have an Office of Racial Equity that sits right next to us and right next to the budget folks. I've got a slide that can show you a little bit about their input as well. But since 2023, they've also looked at all the same proposals we have and given a similar 4-star score. The focus is obviously a little bit different, but it's focused on, first of all, alignment to district and agency racial equity goals, with the idea of being aware of and dismantling systemic inequities by race and indeed by other groups. What data do you bring to bear on that? Not necessarily evaluation information, but what data do you know about the problem and the unequal distribution of opportunity and access? How is that disaggregated? What consultation have you done with community, and particularly communities that are most marginalized or most impacted by by what's being proposed? And then a consideration of unintended trade-offs. And one of the things that I really love about this is it puts consultation with community right next to other considerations as valid data. And then you can see this is on the screen. A bit of the format that budget decision makers have before them when they're considering trade-offs and which enhancements they seek to fund. Because evidence and of what works matters, it's there on the slide. And also, indeed, this slide is a source of discussion. So in the discussion, and racial equity and our assessment of awareness and potential impact on racial equity is right there too. Now, this isn't a full answer, and I think Jacqueline in the chat pointed out that there are inequities in what we even know about what we can know about a program as well. We do our best internally to push against that. The racial equity assessment is also a good check because it considers explicitly, whose voice is not being heard, who has been understudied, and are we pushing against that? And so this is one attempt to formalize that, recognizing that it's a step and not in itself a solution.
Great. Thank you all so much for sharing that perspective, sharing some of the templates, definitions, process that you all are already laying out. There's so many different examples of what this looks like in state, local, federal government. There's only one federal agencies, but it all really depends on sort of what is the goal and then how are they leveraging evidence. So we have 5 minutes for audience questions. I've been trying to scroll back to sort of see when they came in, and would love folks to come off mute and ask them. So the first one I'll just go to Gemma. If your question is still like relevant, you want to bring it up, please come off mute and ask.
Maybe Jen, I can, this is Carrie,
Go for it.
step in. Like I was looking at the questions in the chat, and a lot of them are around, and I think we addressed this a little bit, particularly in your last comment, Ryan, but a lot of the questions are around the different types of evidence there are, generalizability of evidence, trying to understand where, there is evidence and there isn't evidence, and how do we are we just prioritizing things that happen to have an evidence base because they have been studied? Like that kind of sums up a whole bunch of the questions to me. And I think maybe having the panelists address that a little bit more would be helpful. I think you all addressed that in your answers previously to a certain extent, but I mean, we could spend an entire, 3 hours talking about this easily. Does anybody want to take that?
I can start, and I think the biggest part is to not treat evidence as the be all and end all, because all of those things that go into what is studied and what isn't, and also to be humble and circumspect about what we know and why we know it about different programs. And so I think a big part of it is making sure that there's room for innovation in big and small ways in the process. And so there can be in the rating system that Ryan shared, there can be extremely compelling proposals that only get 1 star in it because nobody studied it, or it's being very well informed by the reality in Washington, D.C. on the ground that an agency is operating on. And to make sure that the processes allow for that and have space to hold up those things. And so one very concrete way that can happen in the budget meetings that I was a part of is literally when we have a turn to speak, to be able to hold up those examples and say, this is 1 star, but this is extremely compelling for these reasons. And I think that allows some of that bridging of what is being worked on and what isn't, and doesn't put too strong a weight on what has been studied.
All right. Thank you, Carrie, for synthesizing that. There's so many great questions in the chat. Is there anybody else who we probably have room for one more question. If anybody from the audience wants to come off mute and just sort of ask what they're interested to know, I'm sure there's a lot of burning questions.
Maybe I actually can come off mute then. This is Vincent. This relates a little bit to the previous question that Carrie helped to synthesize, but knowing that evidence often doesn't come from your specific context, or it might not be focused on that particular population, or it may be related to a similar style of intervention, but for a different policy area. How do you all think about generalizability of evidence from different contexts, different populations, different policy areas as part of the budgeting process?
Give the 1 sentence response and then allow Ryan to build on that, which is anything that helps, anything that gets closer to the truth. And so there's going to be things that are exactly right, but that's rare. So anything that gets us closer to understanding the impact. That was 3 sentences.
I'll add there's a healthy balance of humility involved too, and just acknowledging where the differences are. So that's available to decision makers. We don't see our role as being the arbiters of what is or is not a good decision because the evidence is there or isn't. We see ourselves as being advisors and weighing in honestly on what you can know and what you can't know, at least not yet. And doing what we can through evaluation or through community engagement or through service design techniques to build the information base that's available to decision makers.
Um, I almost feel like I wish this was a contest show where I could phone a friend because I'm sure Katarina, who's actually in the audience, would have a better answer than I than I have for this. But I know that for our evaluation team, generalizability and taking into account the local context, not just taking at face value what has been found in other places, is important, and that's actually reflected in our definition of evidence. Um, what I know is like Sam said, anything that helps is good, but also if at least we have concerns that something that's worked somewhere may or may not work here, then that can guide our approach to implementation and making sure that we're tracking the information that will allow us to make that assessment, right? Okay, in what context, with what characteristics, either were the services that are being provided, the providers themselves, or the population that is being served, what are the factors that actually drive success, and how does that relate to the county? And so, again, it is definitely part of how we're thinking about this. Just I may not have the best answer to it.
Still a great answer, Ricardo. Thank you. So just to wrap up, thank you all to the panelists. I'm so grateful for you sharing your expertise. My key takeaway here was that, evidence matters. It really matters to bring in how you define that to all of the folks in government that are going to be making decisions. It's an ongoing conversation. This is not meant to tell us what is right, wrong, should be invested in or not. It is meant to be a tool to help guide decision making, to narrow the gap between what we know and what we really want to be achieving. So thank you all for really sharing that. And I will pass it over to Carrie and Vincent.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And I think we have a slide of resources for folks who want to dig in a little bit deeper. Of course, we had, limited time here and we could spend a lot of time on this conversation. We will send this out to all of you so you can dig in. I'll just note that Results for America is holding another budgeting for what works sprint coming up for counties, I believe. Is that right, Jen? It's for counties.
It is for counties, but we actually are, I think we're going to be opening it up for cities as well, if y'all are
Right.
interested. So I'll let me know. We'll
Yeah.
accept it.
Super. So take a look and, Vincent, I just wanted to reflect that I think what I really came away from this is how it's really about creating that deeper culture of learning or a culture of deeper learning, however you want to put it. It's not about, it's about evidence-informed policymaking and how we can use evidence to move towards better decisions, not using evidence as, kind of a grade for whether something passes the bar or not. Did you have a reflection you wanted to share too?
Yes, I couldn't agree more with that, Carrie. I think oftentimes people worry about evidence and evaluation because they see it as a thumbs up or a thumbs down. But I think the
Yeah.
panel summarized it perfectly, where evidence should be a conversation starter to help us really dig deeper on ultimately how do we improve outcomes, given that we do have limited resources to spend. And I think that communication around how evidence should be used, how it can be useful, aligning on key definitions of what we even mean when we say the word evidence in budgeting or evidence for decision making is really instrumental to that process of learning and that culture of learning that we're really hoping to encourage.
Yeah. And I think how that definition doesn't preclude other ways of learning about things, right? But it's helping us to think about how we really engage in a deeper process and move things forward to a way that improves outcomes for our communities. So thank you everyone who attended. It was great to have you here. I hope you'll come to more of our events in the future. And thank you to Jen, Ryan, Ricardo, Sam for sharing your insights and your humble expertise. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. See you
Thank
next
you.
time.